IT. Before we get started, though, a couple housekeeping issues for everyone. While there will be some time for Q&A, if you don't mind, try and keep your microphone muted during the presentation. That would be awesome. With so many of us working from home, it is inevitable that one of your neighbors will most certainly begin mowing their lawn at this time. But if you do have a question mid-presentation, feel free to use the chat functionality, or if you're familiar with Teams, don't hesitate to raise your hand, and I will make sure to try and weave your question into Matt and Jim's presentation. Also, keep an eye on the chat as throughout this presentation, I'll be posting some updates, some links that might be useful, whether it's during or after the presentation. Just some ways to make sure that you keep interacting. But now that I've gotten sort of the housekeeping out of the way, let's get down to business. So many of you are members of the defense industrial base, and you've likely been inundated with all sorts of stories concerning the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, or CMMC. With so much information available at your fingertips, it can be daunting to know what to do, what documentation is necessary, when to do it, and frankly, who can help with any of this. And so I'm going to take a wild guess that if you're attending this webinar, you've asked these exact questions probably within the last week or within the last month. So as a way to help your organization tackle these questions, two of our CMMC registered practitioners here at KAMIND IT are here to answer some of those questions that you might have. So first on the line is Jim Hodge. He is the Director of Security here at KAMIND IT, where he's brought a wealth of security experience to the position. He's very well versed in NIST 800-171 and CMMC regulations, and with a breadth of experience in implementing those programs at organizations similar to yours. And secondly, as part of our presentation today, is our CEO, Matt Katzer, who has been in cybersecurity for over 10 years. Not only is he the CEO of KAMIND IT, but he was also did a lot of work with the security teams back at Intel. As the CEO of KAMIND IT, we are lucky enough to be the only registered practitioner organization here in the state of Oregon, and we have on staff 7 registered practitioners to help you with your journey of CMMC accreditation. I'm one of them too. But anyway, so those that will be who be your presenters for today. Jim, I'd certainly love for you first to say hello, and then we will kick it over to Matt to get our presentation started. But most importantly, welcome everyone, and have a good time, I guess. So Jim, take it away.
Thank you, Brendan. Hi, everyone. I'm Jim, the security lead. I look forward to helping you on your CMMC journey and answering any questions you may have. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Jim. Thanks, Brendan. This is Matt Katzer, and welcome everyone to our CMMC 4 Steps to Accreditation. I mean, as Brendan has said in the intro, I mean, when you look at what you have to actually do as a defense contractor and everything else and how it's changing, it's really just mind-blowing. And it's mind-boggling in that aspect. And if you look on top of what really has happened, and I will go back to this one slide because, you know, KAMIND IT, we're pretty much we're a Microsoft managed partner. And this is a slide Sadia has, and he presented this this past year about June. But basically what's happening, we're seeing this as throughout the entire industry, is that basically the amount of transition, the amount of conversion that's happening is phenomenal. They're seeing development efforts that would normally take years to do being done in 2 to 3 months. Because we go through into the COVID and we go into this post-COVID environment, it's not only of us as how we have changed things in terms of how we actually manage the processes, how we actually build their business efficiencies. It's also in terms of the bad actors. They're doing the same thing. What's gone on with SolarWinds, for instance, in terms of some of what the Russians are doing, what the Chinese have been doing in terms of the terms of exchange server exploiting the exploits from them. I mean, this is a constant moving target. And what's really, I think of it's when you actually look at what's going on, all of us, I mean, we're all business owners, we're all custodians for our businesses in terms of our client data and everything associated with it. We basically have to step back and look at, are we doing the right things? And we talk about, and when you look at CMMC, there's really two aspects of it, and that's what we're going to cover here in terms of the 4 steps. One aspect is that what do we need to do as custodians for information, not only for us, but for our employees? What do we need to do as custodians to make sure that we actually handle the business process and the information necessary to make sure that our environments, our companies that basically we're part of, are successful in their endeavors? And then we take those things and say, okay, what do we need to do as a byproduct of those things to adapt to new regulations that are being placed upon us by the federal authorities and state authorities? And this is how this whole thing, this is the way we look at CMC. And when you look at what CMMC is from the accreditation standpoint, CMMC is basically trying to put in place a set of standards and practices and processes that we all need to measure by, and we all have to basically adapt to. That's what's going on. And, for KAMIND IT, we handle both commercial and defense industrial based contractors. And quite honestly, is that the practices we're talking about CMMC are the standard practices that we pretty much deploy in the commercial industry, because that's as a good custodian is what we need to do. So let's go look at the dilemma that we're all faced with this whole thing. And it really comes down to what we call data risk management. And there's really a couple different processes. You have to basically analyze what's going on in terms of the data in the environment. You have to establish baseline protections, and you can have all sorts of standards like, that people have in terms of what you want to meet. But really the measurement of your success of an organization is how you actually compare yourself from where you were versus where you're going. It's discovery of the data that you actually have, looking at the compliance standpoint, and also in terms of the recommendations in terms of what you need to do. And when you look at this whole thing, it's a constant evolution. It's a constant process. It's evolving over time. And you have to have processes and practices in place to basically address this. Now, KAMIND, we're in our CMMC RPO. We supply 365 and Azure licenses in the corporate side, and also in terms of ITAR. We also supply in GCC High and both in Azure. And we do a lot of compliance implementation in terms of readiness tests, and also in terms of monitoring the different security programs to make sure you maintain compliance. And we'll talk about what that really means. And then also we're aligned a lot with terms of Microsoft. We're on a couple of different Microsoft activities, such as the Microsoft Accelerator program for CMMC with the CMMC template. And we'll actually have the placement we'll talk a little bit about later if we actually want to implement your own type of, know what they actually need to do and have some guidelines, because that's all what we're all looking for. But stepping back in terms of the pieces that you actually have, what the CMMC standard has, and this has evolved out in terms of the attesting of the NIST 800 and 171, but CMMC is a holistic approach. It's driven by DoD. And in terms of how the structure, it's a verification mechanism. And then basically it's really trying to really standardize how information is handled, in terms of what you need to do for FCI, that's the federal contract information, or the controlled unclassified information, how you actually manage it and what standards you actually need to put in place. And how do you actually know that you're actually doing the right thing? And that's really what CMMC is. Now, there's different types that people will look at it. One is saying, oh, this is just another thing being forced upon me. But you have to step back and look at this from a standpoint of how does this impact my business, or what do I need to do in my business environment to make sure that I'm a good steward for the information that third-party vendors and primes are actually contracting to me, and how do I actually make sure I'm a good steward of information for information I have my employees. That's what it's all about. And that's what CMC is, just another approach to trying to bring that basis in place for us. Now, when you look at what was happened in the past, and this is a slide that we picked up from one of the DoD presentations when they talk about the introduction of the CMMC. Originally, people looked at cybersecurity as this add-on. Oh, I go buy this security product and do this function, or I would do this as a point in time. And then I wouldn't change my business process of how I manage projects, how I schedule them, how I actually do my performance and different activities. But what's happening now is that cybersecurity, especially with everything that's been happening, is you have to really internalize that this is a fundamental change in terms of your business structure. Your business has to be built on a cybersecurity mentality. And it doesn't really matter if you're actually going for defense contractors, what you're doing, but fundamentally is your business has to be built with this from day one. And the way you actually handle information systems and computer systems and everything else, you basically have to have the information compartmentalized and organized in such a way that you can actually manage it. And this is what CMMC trying to do. It's the maturity processes that we all need to follow to make sure that we're doing the right thing. And that's what the basis of CMMC is. Now, when you look at what CMMC did, they came up this model of processes and practices. So they dealt in different types of domains. And there's multiple domains and different levels depending on the organization, depending on the type of information that you have. And if you look at what CMMC in the basic standpoint, there's like level 1 and level 3 to level 5, for instance. Level 1 basically is what we should be doing in all of our business. It doesn't really matter what we have. In fact, what we've done is that for KAMIND IT, for instance, in our corporate customers, the non-DoD customers, we actually implement something between a level 1, level 2 cybersecurity model. That's just the way it is because you have to do that. And that's what is expected in the corporate environment. And what's happening in terms of the DoD environment, you're actually getting the same type of structure, but we're to actually kind of coordinate additional information because there's now rules about how you handle FCI or CUI and FCI information. Now, to give you some ideas, some definitions, I posted some things here to make sure we're all talking about the same thing. So FCI is federal contract information. That is information that's not intended for public release. So when you actually get a federal contract or contract associated with it, I'm sure you guys all know this, but I just want to kind of go over it. But that information is not to be disclosed publicly. So you need to do with the necessary protection in place to have that in the organization. Controlled unclassified information, for instance, is basically, that's information the government creates or possesses or the entity possesses on behalf of the government. Think of controlled unclassified information as a lot about the trade secrets or about what you would actually do for an internal organization if you're not doing DoD work. It's stuff unique to the business that makes it special. That's what CUI is. But the way in a federal contract, when you actually have a federal contract that's generating this information, this is extremely important. And basically, you provide the same practices on it. And getting back to what I've said earlier is that we're all stewards for the information that we manage, be it it's our employee information, be it it's the business information, how we conduct our processes and practices. All that stuff is important. Now, the other aspect we talked about is GCC High that you've seen. This is a version of Office 365 that is restricted for government or defense contractors. So it's a different version and there's some rules associated with it. Now, the other foundation we have registered practitioners such as KAMIND. You have certified assessors. Those are individuals that usually part of a C3PO that do certification. Now, what's interesting on CMMC is that as an organization, we can be registered practitioner, we can provide implementation strategies and licensings and things like that to our clients, but we cannot act as a certified assessor. Likewise, a certified assessor cannot provide implementation assistance they have to there's basically a wall between them. So either one side or the other. Organization RPO, this is organization specialized in implementation assessments and third-party assessors. We talked about what those are. Now, how this is all managed is through the DoD, there's an independent body called the CMMC AB Accreditation Board. This is where all that we get licensed through, all that we go through approval, how we register and everything else, and active participants. That's in terms of what KAMIND. We're actually an RPO registered with the CMMC AB. And a system security plan, this is the formal plan that designs a plan of action to secure a computer system or information system. And you all should be having an SSP. And if you don't have an SSP or one in place, it's something that you need to, talk to us and we can actually help you through the process. Now, the other aspect people look at is going to be the timeline. The timeline is very kind of significant. 2025 you think is a long time away, but 2025 is not that far. especially when you look at the number of defense industrial contractors that have to get certified by 2025 is 320,000. So US has 50 states. That works out about 6,400 defense contractor per state. So when you actually start figuring out and looking at what it takes to actually do it and how you actually implement something, there's a lot of activity associated with how fast that we go through this and how do you actually get it. And you have to look from your business standpoint how you are actually going to meet it, because the DoD has been very clear. If you're going to bid on contracts come January 1st, 2026, you will have a CMMC specification. And in order to have a CMMC certification, you're going to have to make sure those practices and processes are in place probably at least 6 months ahead of time to make sure the maturity model. It's not like the old days where, oh shoot, the assessor here, so let's quickly get the documents done and quickly put the processes in place and not worry about it afterwards. That's not what CMMC is. CMMC is a fundamental change to how we do things. It's a maturity mentality. Now, the thing that there's something to look at, that I take this out of this is from the courtesy of the National Defense Industry Association. They published a kind of a interim rule overview. There's a DFARS provisions for Rule 7019 that basically is talking about the NIST 800-171 assessment. And this is kind of important to actually understand, is that basically if you have an active contract, and I kind of translated this on a simpler slide, but basically if you have an active contract, it requires certain things. You have to have a NIST 800. It has to be more than 3 years old. You have to score it. And it covers a contract information system. That is the information in the contract you receive. It's relevant to your offer or contract. And the score must be posted in the SPRS, which is the Supplier Performance Risk Management System. And the DoD will have visibility in the score. So if you're a contractor, basically you have to have these scores posted. And if you're eligible for future contracts, once you're in the system, DoD is going to look at that SPRS filing and determine how you actually manage it. Now, in order to actually do things and keep in terms of starting next year, they already have talked about they're planning for audits. DIBCAC is planning for audits of noncompliance. And then as we get through the pieces and everything else, that's kind of what's actually happening. And so you got to make sure that as you look through what you're trying to do and some of the things you're trying to achieve, you got to make sure you have the right pieces in place. And there's already, if you posted it, you've been on the Spur's filing website, the PI site, they're already planning to announce a Spur filings for CMMC, which is going to be interesting to see how it happens. So what do you do? And what is the right strategies that you actually have? And that's been the challenge, the questions that we're all trying to do and what you're trying to actually look at. And the best way to actually understand this whole process model is to go look at the CMMC security process model in general. And we looked at there's really 4 components that we actually see. And if you have an active contract, you're going to have to do a certain scoring, or you have one already for a NIST 800-171, and that gives you a score of the 110 controls. So you have a score value. There's going to be scoping work in terms of what needs to be scoped. And scope is, when we talk about scope, we're talking about what an assessor is going to look at. So you have, and we'll talk a little bit more what that means. And then once you understand the scope, you have to understand the gap. So in the scoped areas, you have to say, okay, now what are the gap in that scope area against the CMMC level 1 or level 3 specifications that I'm actually going for assessment for? And then you're going to have to do the implementation. Those are that's the way the process flow works. And if you look at it, what you're trying to do on a bigger picture is you're going through this whole concept of looking at the CMMC domains. And these are taken from, there's some additional domains on top of what's in NIST 800, 180, 171 specification. But in terms of how you actually look at the different from a practice and process standpoint. And then you start saying, okay, now what does my organization need to do? How do we actually change it? So it's a security mindset that's going to change, and that's what you have to adapt to. Now, once you implement CMMC, it's not just, I bought this product, I'm over and done with. It's a life cycle change. So think of things this way, is that right now we're in like CMMC version 1. DoD has already said that there's going to be update to the versions coming through the following year. Now, what they also have said is that when you get an accreditation, so let's say I go through and I get my accreditation, that means I hired a C3PO, I've gone through my implementation with someone like KAMIND as an RPO. I hired a C3PO. They basically gone through, I got a passing score. The CMC AB has issued me a certification. That's accreditation. So we're at year 1 on that. And the next time I have to redo this is going to be 3 years. So that's in year 4. During this time is you're going to have a change in terms of the requirements of CMMC. Now, under the CMC, the way the specifications are designed, you have to have an active management with continuous audit, which means that from an organization, you have to actually monitor and manage the practices and what's being implemented. And then you have to actually look and continuous audit and basically make sure you adapt accordingly. And also, as the specification changes, there's going to be new features associated with it, and you have to build these into your process. So it's an evolutionary process. It's not a set it and forget it as NIST 800-171 was. And then when you come up for your year 2 accreditation, if you do the things correctly, you'll be in a model where you're basically fully accredited in terms of what needs to be done. You basically have done the hard work, but that's the mindset that you must have. And that's how you actually implement CMMC. And the question that you're going to have that you have to follow, it's going to come down to what is your strategy? What is your timeline? How do you plan for November 2025? Are you going to get an external company to assist you? How do you plan to monitor in the audit compliance? Now, keep in mind, when we talk about audit compliance in terms of the model that we typically use, we actually have, in terms of organization, we have an implementation team, for instance, and then we have a security team. And then we turn around and basically what the security team is actually make sure we monitor and make sure we keep the pieces in there. And we have a compliance team that basically continues to go audits through the process and see what changes, see if we're in compliance or out of compliance and make adjustments to it. That's the mentality that you have to follow. And that's the mentality that you're going to have to do in terms of looking at CMC. Now you have basically 4 years to put processes like that in place to be successful. And if you do it, you can keep your costs under control and you built this into a life cycle. That's the nature of your business. And then from a standpoint, out of that you find out is that how structured your security plans are. And then the other issues that if you did a NIST 800, 180, 800, 171 filing, for instance, you have a POAM. And then you get all these factors fall into how you're planning to do this process, how you actually try to get into this model. But keep in mind, 100% of contractors are going to have to be CMMC compliant on January 1st of 2026. So what are the 4 steps to CMMC? And that's what we're all really here for. And we kind of talked about, gave you some background on the pieces. But it really comes down to this, is that, if you're an active contractor right now, you should have an NIST 800-171 score assessment. And you'll have a POAM associated with it because you're required to actually have that. And then once you have that piece, then the next piece you do is you do a scope assessment. Now, if you're new in terms of not a contractor, you just want to get ready for things, you can actually skip like step 1 and say, okay, let's just do a scope assessment. We actually recommend that you really look and do look at the 800-171. You can do a self-assessment for this as well. It's pretty straightforward. There's a lot of things, but you really want to actually work with someone to kind of understand what the pieces are. But the next piece you actually have is you scope. Now, what scope is all about is scope's about when you look at a contract from your entity. There's something called as in terms of contract areas or in terms of host unit, and there's included areas. So you want to basically make sure you understand where those things are. And the reason for this is that you want to have the assessors, when you actually go in for a CMMC accredited assessment, is focused on those areas. And then that's the key. And then basically when you do your gap assessment, you want to do the gap assessments on the scope areas. And then you're going to implement the CMMC controls against the scope areas. Now, from a cybersecurity model, I would take my company, I'll implement controls across the entire company. But what I will do is that I will actually take and say, I'll reduce the scoped areas. So basically, this is the area that I'm basically going to have covered under, in terms of the assessor for level 3, or this is the area for level 1. So I can actually control costs because that's what it's all about. So That's how the approach you actually want to take on the big picture. So the first step one, start with a score assessment. If you have an active contract or bidding on contracts, you have two things. If you have an active contract, you have to have a Spur filing. DoD published in terms of interim rule that we talked about, the 7019. You basically need to have that in place starting 2020. Now, what's going to happen is DIPCAC is going to be auditing that's going to be coming. And the maturity score shows what the assessment guidelines are. And that gives you an idea and keeps on terms of the way we look at it when a company has like a NIST 800-171 score assessment. We review the POAM, for instance, we review the system security plan and their score number, and we get an idea of what is maturity level of the company. That's basically what you get out of like a NIST 800-171. When you start doing a scope assessment, what you really are trying to do is you're trying to figure out in the organization, how do I actually limit the areas that I want to scope activities? So I have this big company, for instance, I can say, yeah, I want to put level 3 across the company. But does that actually, what level 3 really means is that I'm going to actually take my entire company and I'm going to have the assessor, when it's the assessor comes in the door, they're going to look at everything from that point, from the reception on the desk, right back through the entire organization. Is that what you want to try to assess in the company? Or are you basically saying, okay, well, I may have 150 people in the company, but there's really only 20 of them that are basically doing, FCI information that has access into it. And out of that smaller subset, I may only have 15 that actually have the combination FCI plus CUI information. So why not basically scope the environment that I want to have the assessors for those smaller areas? And by limiting the scope, it's cost savings. And it's also going to make it easier in terms of what you want to do. Now, you got to step inside when we talk about scope assessments, set apart what we want to talk about cybersecurity maturity model management. From a security management, I'm going to manage from the person that comes in the door, how I manage the entry logs, how I manage the video, how I manage the reception. I'm going to put my security model across the entire organization. We're going to manage everybody at the same level. But from an assessor standpoint, when the assessor comes in, I want them to have them focus only on the areas that are going to have access to that information. And remember all that need to know that we've been talked about in terms of information that comes through. That's the way you actually have to look at who has need to know information in FCI, who has need to know information in CUI and FCI. And then the other aspect you look at is that you want to also restrict what happens when you actually have a data spill. Do you want to have DIS come in and basically wipe out the entire organization, or you basically want to control it? And that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to reduce risk. And that's how you're going to get through implementation. And the reason for this is a slide that came out that DoD published in terms about about 2 years ago. They look at what the cost of CMMC certification. And I put some prices on 365 Azure High. So you can have organizations, you say, well, geez, and this is like a 25-person organization. Do you really want to have spending, $110,000 a year in terms of level 3? If I can actually reduce the scope of that down to just the people that need to actually be assessed, I'm going to actually try to do that so I can actually control my cost structure. This is how you get into concepts of enclave. I may have an organization that's 100% 365 based and I have something in corporate Azure, but I only have a small subset, those 15 or 20 people that need to have the GCC high subscriptions. So I'm going to build an enclave just for those people dealing with that issue so I can basically compartmentalize it. So I keep the information that they need to know. That's the whole basis of what you want to try to do with scoping. And then once you actually get that area, you scope the areas, then you basically go through and you say, okay, now I'll implement the controls company-wide because that's what a good steward of data does. And that's what we are as custodians. We want to make sure that we are doing the right things, not only for our employees, but also for our clients and the vendors that we actually work with. But from an assessor standpoint, I'm going to actually have the assessor, when the assessor comes in the door, I can actually bring in, keep in mind under CMMC, the assessors will visit your facility to verify it. And if you have work-at-home workers, they're going to basically want to see the work-at-home workers. So the assessor is going to understand, okay, is how you're actually controlling information. Do you actually have the the model where there's one locked door between access information when someone comes through. What type of controls do you have in place? All those things basically come into being, and you have to look at it from an organization standpoint, how you're going to manage it. And then from a once you get this whole concept of understanding what the assessment is into scope areas, then that gives you the process to control the cost. Because you now basically have gone into, okay, what do I need to do? And then you can actually get the assessment down. And then on the implementation, you basically look at, you start implementing on the scoped areas. Now, keep in mind is that this diagram we showed earlier, this is an evolutionary process. So when you actually do an implementation, you get accreditation. What's going to happen is you have to put a continuous management and continuous audit process in place that's going to constantly look at this in terms of what's happened and everything else. And that's kind of what you want to, that's when you look at CMMC, when you look at terms of the requirements, what you have to actually do, you have to think of this from a company-wide picture, but also from a management. How am I going to manage this activity? And with this, you're going to actually drive a culture shift in the company for security. And that's going to have everyone who comes in the company. Now, scoped areas is an interesting thing too, because way CMMC is written, there is a fall down for basically contractors and subcontractors. So if you have a scoped area and you have a bunch of subcontractors that are working with it, and that scoped area is a level 3, all those contractors in that scoped area that has access to that CUI and FCI information are going to have to be at the same accreditation level. Do you want to, if you want to basically look and bringing like an HVAC contractor in your office, do you want to have an HVAC contractor require them to do level 3 to go in that area? Or how are they going to have access to the FCI or CUI information? And look in terms of some of the breaches that happened in the past. A lot of these things were from third-party contractor. Look in terms of what happened to the F-35 in terms of how it was cloned by the Chinese. That was due because of a facility contractor that came in that wouldn't put security controls in place. Those are the things you need to do. So you really want to focus the information, how you control and how you manage it. So what is the process? And I thought I would actually kind of just spend you real quick a few minutes on this so you understand what the process is. So once you go through this process flows, these 4 steps, the next piece is you start the accreditation process. And the accreditation process is that it's very simple. It's kind of defined by the CMCAB Accreditation Board, is that you're going to bring in a basically a C3PO, and they're going to come through and you have assessors and you're going to work an arrangement with them and they're going to assess the environment for you. And that's, remember, we're assessing the scoped area and you're going to get the certification for that. That's how that's going to work. Then afterwards, what you're going to do is you're putting this process in place because you want to do continuous management. You want to control those costs. You don't want to pay this ongoing, point in time that you have to pay, $100,000, $200,000 reassess the environment because every time you turn around, you have to build it as an evolutionary process. That is the secret of CMMC. And you have to look at it from a standpoint of how I get there and how I get into this process model. And that's how you're going to be successful. So questions we were asked, how do you get started? Well, you have a kind of information. I drew this kind of these 4 steps. So you have a DIY approach. So you can do these 4 steps yourself in terms of how it handles, and we have some tools that you can actually use. But once you get to step 5, then you're going to have to do a C3PO to do an assessment, and you're going to either, when you look at an active security management with continuous compliance, you're either going to have to build an infrastructure to do that, or you're going to have to hire a third party to come in and do that. And then as you go through for your year 4, you're going to have to bring in another C3PO to do your accreditation for year 4. So this is kind of the process model that you'll see put in place. So resources you can do to get this in Oregon, for instance, you can, if you're new into the defense industrial place, go give a call to, GCAP. They're great folks and everything else. They're on 365 as well, and a good organization. There's also, if you're a manufacturer, there's the Manufacturer National Network, and here's the contact information at oemp.org, and get in touch with them as well. And they have resources. They're basically are DoD contractors, and they basically are there to help businesses be successful, how they actually handle, and especially small businesses, because that's what this is about. And what DoD tries to do with all the activity is trying to level the playing field to make sure that we all can be successful. So we're um, not basically limited from dealing in certain contracts. The other thing you do is there's something known as on the Microsoft stack, there's something known as a Microsoft CMMC placement. And what we have, if you fill out the feedback form, we'll give you the latest version of the CMMC placement. And what this does is maps your Microsoft 365 E3 and E5 subscriptions to different practices and processes and tells you the things you need to do. And you end up with a diagram that looks like this. And it basically shows you like the areas in terms of what's really covered in terms of the primary services and everything else and the practices involved on it. So this is extremely useful tool. The other thing is once you're on the Microsoft 365 E stack is you have access to other things. This is an example of using one in terms of Azure. We deploy a lot of Azure with Azure Sentinel, which is one of the requirements. You have to have some type of security monitoring. Our SIM that we actually use for our deployments, we actually use Azure Sentinel. This actually has also an analysis of all the data that's being collected and basically what's going on in different types of domains and processes and domains and practices in terms of access control and accountability. So you have a view from there. The other thing that Microsoft has also added, you can do this for yourself as well. If you're on the E5, you actually can load up the Microsoft Compliance Manager. And the compliance managers say, okay, I'm going to go apply a level 3 controls to and just see where I am and give an understanding of what the pieces are and what you actually have to do. So those are kind of the 4 major tools that you have, and those are very straightforward to actually use and see what you can actually get an idea of how good you are in the various deployments and what you have and what you can do. Or what you can do is give us a call and we can help you through the process. We can help you do the readiness check for CMMC. You look at moving your office and seeing what type of office licenses do you need to move to GCC High for CMMC Level 3. So you can book with one of our practitioners and give a call to Brandon or Mike and just get an idea of what you actually need to do. And those are really the 4 steps that you want to follow. So what I like to do is that if you're interested, you want to get a copy of this placement, I have a picture of this in the upper right-hand corner. Just go to the KAMIND.com/feedback and just put in the request and just fill out your information and we'll provide you a copy of that. And with that, we have some time open that I wanted to leave so we can have some questions, and I'll pass it over to Brendan and see what questions that we have.
Awesome, Matt. Thank you very much for the presentation. To all the folks who joined, and I know a handful of people may have joined a little late. If you are interested in a recording of this presentation, I'll certainly be able to pass that along to you later on today. It takes a little bit of time. Also, if you were monitoring the chat, I included some of the links to some of the resources that Matt had mentioned to assist you. Many of them are Oregon focused, but if you are in a different state, I'd be more than happy to send the state specific resource for you. The best way to do that is either email myself. Many of you have gotten an email from me already, or you can put that information in the feedback. The last link that I popped in there, Linda, I will make sure you get a copy of this, is the feedback form directly, so you can fill that out. And the last thing about the feedback, and this is something a little fun, is if you don't mind, if you do fill out the feedback form, put in a mailing address, because I'm going to handwrite cards to thank every single person in there. Well, the best part is one of you is going to wind up with a Starbucks gift card in your thank you card for attending. So $25 gift card to one lucky recipient. That will be determined when I mail out the cards later on this afternoon. But most importantly, as Matt said, are there any questions that need answering? Feel free to unmute yourself, unless of course you're one of those folks who has the lawnmower in the background. Please feel free to ask questions. Both Jim and Matt are ready to go. I'm also checking to see if anybody's raising their hand as well. Matt, it looks like we have a question from the chat from our friend Arvin. Arvin, how do I think about Microsoft solutions and the CMMC compliance and enclaves? Enclaves is a term that we didn't use, so maybe we want to define enclaves and then discuss the Microsoft approach to an enclave. Great question, Arvin. Thank you.
Yeah, Arvin, thanks for the question. Yeah, so yeah, I didn't quite mention. So when you actually look at like a scoped area, for instance, let's say you want to do a level 3 scoped area. What that means is that I'm going to actually build an enclave where I'm just going to have just those people in that scoped area that basically have access to GCC high. And the rest of the company, for instance, will be like, will basically be 365. And so what you're trying to do is you're trying to actually look at enclaves from a standpoint is how do I actually contain information and how do I actually make sure if there's going to be a data spill, something that happens that basically makes sure it's isolated into the enclave. And the other aspect of that is that you're trying to actually separate the environment so that you in essence have where I'm going to handle my ERP system, where I'm going to handle my other activities. And so you have that outside of it. Now the secret, and that's what an enclave is. So, and when you look at what some primes are doing, because of with CMMC, we're seeing some primes now saying, okay, we will provide you like a Windows Virtual Desktop environment into a GCC high, into our basically as part of your subcontract. And so they're going to actually provide the environment because they have responsibilities to a certain amount, just like you have responsibility for it. And they're trying to figure out how the best way to control costs. So we're seeing activity like that. Now, the second part of the question is about the Microsoft 365 security stack. And this is the secret that you actually, when you look at security and everything else, when you look at what Microsoft does in third party, the secret on the Microsoft security, and we're definitely using the Microsoft security solutions, and we use them in all our clients, is that you have to implement the Microsoft security solution across the board. That is the secret. And then you basically look in terms of if there's additional things that you want to put outside of it. And I mean, we've seen this is that where we see problem areas in people that have implemented 365 in terms of security solution, they pick and choose which parts of security, the Microsoft security, they add a third party, and they have this, and basically they have this area where they have holes. The Microsoft security stack is a layered security model. And every layer builds on top of everything else. And if you look at it from the way the endpoint manages happen, how you actually remediate endpoint, how you actually handle spam filters, how you actually handle the whole pieces of it, it's basically is an integrated process and you look at it. And the secret in terms of how you actually manage the Microsoft stack and Microsoft security, and we don't have any clients that we have implemented without a full SIM, we actually deploy Azure Sentinel. And we build out our playbooks and our workbooks and our runbooks to basically make sure that we can do remediation, plus we do investigations. That's the secret of the Microsoft stack. If you decide to piecemeal it approach, then you're going to have gaps in it, and then you'll start looking at third parties because these pieces are not implemented. But if you implement it correctly and you implement it with the security management controls, then basically it does two things. It reduces your cost, and it basically drives uniform across the organization. Now, when you talk about an enclave like we have, for instance, you could implement the entire Microsoft security controls across the entire company and basically put the policies and practices in place that you need to for, CMMC. And then you start looking at the enclave goes in the area, say, okay, I'm going to do the additional level 3 controls that are unique for that, in terms of what you have, but you're putting processes and practices in place across the company, and that's really what you do. And that's how it works.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you for the question. Ooh, looks like we've got another one. Oh, this is a good one. And maybe Jim, maybe this would be probably a little bit, since you're more of the 800-171 expert, talk a little bit more about how the NIST 800-171 score can weigh on an assessment, and what does the score really mean to an organization? Talk about that kind of in the general sense, please.
Yeah, so some of the work and level of effort put forth towards that 800-171 assessment and the score that comes out of it is part of the foundation for future CMMC related activities, whether it be level 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. Because the thing about level 3 builds off of anything in level 2 off of various controls and domains in level 1, and same for 4 and 5. And all of those 5 maturity levels stem from some of those activities in 800-171. And so the scoring that comes out of that gives you not only a score for 800-171, but it also gives you an idea of roughly where you would be for CMMC, even if you had not gone through the 800-171 assessment. And so that's where, if you don't really know what your CMMC potential assessment score would be or how you would fare against a certified assessment, going through that gives you that kind of idea to say, hey, right, we thought we were doing fairly well in this area, but maybe we're not doing as well as we thought.
Yeah, the other aspect to add to that, hey, Jim, that's great what you have. The other aspect is to add for the scoring is that if you have an active contract, the DoD uses a score to actually bid future contracts against. So keep that in mind as well.
Awesome, great follow-up. So we had another question from our friend Patrick Fitzgerald, who is local. We can see his office from here. If an organization is GDPR compliant, so General Data Protection Regulation, more of a European standard, how much more would need to be done to get to CMMC, and what is the difference to get there? So, Matt and Jim, I'm gonna toss it to the two of you combined because I don't actually know this answer.
I think, Jim, I think you have dealt more with some of the banking and some of the process on that and some of the companies you worked for.
Yeah, so some of GDPR, and right, I will not say I'm a GDPR expert by any means, but a lot of that is, a lot of the core focus is on privacy rights versus CMMC is focusing more on FCI and CUI. So that's where some of that would be a little bit different. And of course, CUI and FCI, while that isn't necessarily your personal financial information, it's still, the concepts are the same, right? You have certain sensitive data, whether it be contractual, right, or federal data, or your banking or healthcare related information. And so while some of that may not be an overlap in terms of the actual data, there's a lot of overlap in the sense of how do you know where that data lives in your environment? Can you accurately scan for that data in your environment? Do you know how to protect against data loss prevention when you don't even know the proper data to look for? So while some of that is not quite similar in the types of data, personal versus FCI and CUI, the idea is still absolutely the same. Do you know how to scan for that data? Do you know how to protect that data from being exfiltrated from your environment, either intentionally or unintentionally?
Awesome, thank you, Jim, for that answer. Arvind had a follow-up question, and this is something I've also never. Is it possible to get a negative NIST 800-171 score? And by the way, if that's you have a lot. By the way, I was going to say, if you can get a negative score or you have a negative score, we need to have a long conversation. But Jim and Matt, if you don't mind touching on that.
I mean, from a practical standpoint, yeah, I mean, there's the way you look at the way the scoring sheets work. You can technically you could get a negative score, but if you're getting a negative score, your score is 0. So the question is, why do you find So this is, when you look at the NIST 800-171 assessment stuff, and NIST actually published and DoD published an assessment guide to follow through. And when you look at, there is points deducted for certain cases, but from a filing standpoint, just generally you'll never file anything, so you'll never seen it. And plus, if you're going to file your Spurs filing, you want to get the highest score possible, which is basically trying to get 110 in terms of scoring. Because as a federal contractors go look at what's filed in Spurs, they look at different type of capabilities, and that could actually influence if you are basically getting a contract or a competitor is getting a contract based on your score. So you want to do the best possible.
Awesome. Great questions. We still have about 10 more minutes. I want to be respectful of everybody's time, so I'm going to try and make 11 o'clock Pacific the hard stop. But are there any other questions, whether they be typed into the chat or feel free, like I said, to unmute and ask away?
Well, I will say, short of any questions, especially when pursuing something like level 3, a lot of your environment is going to be scrutinized that may not have been looked at before. A lot of RBAC or role-based access control permissions, various things like you'll hear it called ACLs, access control lists. So a lot of it is really going to focus on whom has access to what. And that can be challenging whether you have 10 people or 100 people. Unfortunately, a lot of times an employee will get lumped into a particular group or security group, and they have access to perhaps a little bit more than was intended, and all of that will get scrutinized during a CMMC assessment.
Which is really, Jim, you bring up a good point, which is really when you look at organizations, you want to make sure you apply the security policies throughout the entire organization. But when you talk about scoped areas, you want to basically focus the scoped areas to keep your cost under control.
Wonderful. And we have a follow-up question. Can you talk about the NIST 800-171 800-53 to 800-171 reciprocity? Either Matt or Jim.
So when you look at like the NIST 800-53 and you look at the NIST 800-171, so the NIST 800-53 was set up more for kind of like the non-DoD contractors. And if you look at like New York Shield, for instance, that's where like the NIST 800-53. So the way that 171 is that 53 is a smaller segment with less controls and less what you have to implement it, and 171 is more of the granddaddy, has more additional stuff that you actually have to do. So when you actually look at like a NIST 800-171, it actually incorporates a lot of the concepts from 53, and you're saying, okay, what are the incremental things you need to do? So when you talk about reciprocity, there's really, it really comes down from a DoD standpoint. It looks at what your NIST 800-171 score is. Now, if you have accomplished the same thing in terms of, okay, how you actually do, like, do you have authentication, how you're doing audits, how you're doing those type of things, those are directly in the 800-171. So basically rolls over, you're doing the same stuff. And a lot of different tools that you actually use if you do like, so you can look like same like guarding HIPAA data, for instance, for health protected information. There's controls you need to put on that in terms of make sure you have devices encrypted, things like that. All those type of concepts are followed through in the 171 as well. It just builds on it.
Awesome. Aaron, with a really good and I think a very important question for everyone. If a company that is a subcontractor for another company that is required to have a higher CMMC score than the subcontractor, does the subcontractor have to meet those requirements as well? I can imagine this is something that'll come up for a lot of you. So Matt and Jim?
Yeah, under CMMC, there's a flow down clause. So it comes down to the information. So if let's say if your prime has, let's say your prime's level 3, and then as a prime basically passes through CUI and FCI information to a sub, and the sub only a level 1, well, guess what? The sub has to actually upgrade to a level 3. And so, or the prime basically has to look the information they decide and say, well, And what DoD really, if you talk to Katie and the other folks, what they really want the prime to do is saying that, does the sub need all this information, and what information do I want to provide them for? So they work in terms of with the contract officer, the prime does, and basically decide what information gets passed through and what level that's associated with it. But in general, there's a flow down clause. So if a prime is a 3 and they're giving you all the CUI and FCI, guess what? As a sub, you have to do a 3. That's why some primes are actually building enclaves for their subs so they can control the information and reduce the cost.
And it looks like we have a follow-up question. Can the prime establish access versus sharing access? Good question, Lewis.
In terms of, it comes down to, it really comes down to how information's actually processed. So if, let's say that the prime basically gives the enclave, for instance, and the prime suddenly says, okay, gives an enclave to a sub, and prime tells a sub just do everything into this environment, then you're contractually bound to make sure that you follow the rules. Now, if you end up basically moving, and the prime's going to basically set that enclave up so that basically it'll put necessary controls so information can't get copied over, is monitored and everything else. And so they're going to build that as part of the environment. So if your thing is talking about sharing, in this case, in this example, since the prime owns the enclave, the prime has responsibility for it. And you're guided by the rules associated using that enclave they provided. If you're, and that's, I think that's in terms of when you talk about sharing information, that's what it is. But the flow down clause is really clear, is that if a prime basically, and where this came about, so we go through history on it, is when you look at what happened like with the J-35, and you see some Navy ships as well, is what happens is the prime basically said, hey, go to a sub, go build me this part, and they gave them the entire specs to build everything, which happens to be tons of CUI information, FCI, the prime really never needed, the sub never needed to really have. So it really comes down to how information's being managed from a prime to a sub, and what information that you actually have determines the level of control you have to implement.
Awesome, Matt. Thank you very much. So we've got about 1 more minute. As I said, I want to try and be respectful of everyone's time. I'm going to type in my email address as well as my salesperson, Mike Class. In case you do have any follow-up questions that we weren't able to cover, we'd be more than happy to answer those for you, get that information to you in a timely fashion. I know some of you were unfortunately delayed in getting in, so if that is the case and you want to make sure you get a recording, feel free to email me, or I've once again put the feedback link back in the chat for everyone to view. But if there are no more questions, most importantly, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day. We know, especially during this time of CMMC, that many of you have a lot of questions and are very busy. And so we certainly want to make sure we were useful and respectful of your time, but also that you found a ton of value. We will have more webinars coming up. Our next one is coming up in March. Specifically on March 20th. So be on the lookout for your email for another invite for that one. And if there's nothing else, thank you so much again for attending. And if you have any follow-up questions, or if you'd like any assistance with your CMMC work, we are here to help. So thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful Thursday.